can go ahead and get started. We'll get class back together here on this cold Thursday morning in Sarasota. This is being televised, as all of y'all know. I told you before, it may not have surprised you when you walked in this morning, but it's being covered by METV, Manatee Educational TV, and it will play on, I know, on METV's channel in Manatee County, and I'm not sure they may be on the Bright House channels and such, and they'll have a YouTube, and I'll let you know later how to access this if you wanted to see it again. But let me introduce myself because it'll be on television. I'm Dan Miller. I'm a retired congressman from this area of the Sarasota-Bradenton area. I was elected to Congress in 1992, served 10 years. I had term limit to myself, and so I retired at the end of 2002. Since retiring, I have enjoyed teaching at different universities and colleges, but especially here in the Lifelong Learning program. Lifelong Learning is an interesting program here at the University of South Florida in Sarasota-Bradenton. They offer classes 4 times a year. I teach once a year in the January-February term. My friend Barbara Murray teaches a class in conversational French and one in walking tour of Paris. So there's a whole series of classes. My wife and I are taking a class on the Roman Empire on Mondays. So those that are interested, go to the website. The next set of classes start in March. My class is the Dysfunctional Congress. It always gets kind of a chuckle because it is a dysfunctional Congress. You know, the congressional approval is at 13%. President Obama's approval is about 40%, which is about where Bush was 6 years into his term. There was a poll out today that 65% of the American people disapprove of our government. We have a huge credibility problem in our governing of the country today. And I don't really see a lot of things changing, at least for the next few years, but it's going to correct itself. And I think we'll get more excited, especially after the 2016 election. You know, Congress last year was considered the least productive Congress in history. And this Congress is going to be less productive than last year's Congress. Last year they tried to, the Senate Democrats and President Obama tried to push through gun control. It went nowhere. It was never going to be voted on in the House. The House Republicans tried to defund Obamacare. It was going nowhere. Government got shut down, and you know, Republicans lost a lot of credibility over that issue. So both sides have now got sort of a truce and say, let's just get ready for the 2014 election. The less Congress is in session, the more popular they are. So what we're going to see is a lot of downtime, and you're going to see a lot more visibility of our local congressmen because they're not going to spend a lot of time in Washington. They're going to find excuses to stay away. And so it's going to be interesting how things evolve this next year. Now, we're going to be talking about lobbying, but with Congress not in session, not doing anything, what are y'all going to do is what we're going to talk about a little bit. But of course, you do a lot more, especially on the regulatory side. You know, lobbying is a topic, and lobbyists have this bad image, and it's unfortunate because, you know, there's, I don't know, I think I saw what, 4,000 lobbyists or some number like that, registered lobbyists in Washington. And of course, we have lobbyists in Tallahassee here also. But they serve a very, very worthwhile purpose. Lobbying has grown dramatically in the past 50 years because government's grown dramatically the past 50 years. When you go back to the 1950s and Medicare and Medicaid were created, all the Great Society programs, housing programs, Head Start programs, into the 70s, the environmental programs. All these programs are just getting bigger and bigger, and so the regulatory effort is even greater. I have an article I'm going to pass out and make available that shows the high-tech industry is just catching in onto lobbying. Microsoft didn't hire lobbyists for 20 years, and they regret it now. I mean, the high-tech industries of Google and Facebook and all these, wait a minute, you know, the federal government controls the airwaves, so, you know, what is the regulatory effort? When they rewrite this legislation, for example, on the NSA about the spying and stuff, how does that affect us? So there's lots of areas of lobbying. 20 years ago when I went to Washington, Moat wasn't involved with Washington. I was on the board of Moat before going to Congress, real active there. But now Moat's getting a lot of federal money. It's important for Moat to get the money to take care of their research efforts because the federal government now supplies a nice source of revenue for them. So locally, the beaches are being renourished right now on Anna Maria Island. I guarantee you there's a lot of lobbying going on to get the bureaucracy, mainly the Corps of Engineers, to accept it. Then it has to get through the House and the Senate before you get the money in the budget to go through those renourishments. So it affects all of us in a lot of different ways. And so what our goal today is hopefully we get a better understanding of what's happening in lobbying, how it works, and a lot of different stories. I have a lot of things I could talk about, the lobbying experiences I had in Washington, which were all positive, with one exception. The sugar lobbyists really didn't like me. The sugar lobby, the sugar lobby is a huge lobby. Citrus has a small lobby. Sugar has a huge lobby. They really went after me. They offered several $100,000 to get me defeated back in 1996, trying to get someone to run. Luckily, they couldn't find anyone to run. But most lobbyists serve a very good purpose and represent their constituents. The sugar lobbyists represent sugar growers. Fine, that's their job, to protect their program. But at any rate, let's move on to our guests. And what I'm going to do is ask each of them to introduce themselves and say how they got into the lobbying profession. I'm going to start with my good friend Joan Galvin, and I want to thank Joan because she's the one that put the panel together. Joan and I have known each other for 20-some years because she used to work for Andy Ireland, my predecessor, and I think you may have worked for me for one day after I got sworn in back in January of '93. And she lives here on Longboat Key, and I'm going to let Joan introduce yourself and describe how you got into lobbying, and then we'll start getting to specifics.
Okay, well, thank you, Congressman. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about lobbying and what we do and maybe set aside some of the misconceptions that may be out there. I don't think any little girl grows up thinking, gee, when I get older, I want to be a lobbyist. Sometimes fate just takes you there, and in my case, that's exactly what happened. I've been a registered lobbyist probably for over 20 years now. My career started on Capitol Hill. I was taking a break from college, and my father didn't want me hanging around the house, so he sent me to Capitol Hill. And back in those days, and I think you're going to be shocked to learn this, the one qualification for getting a job as a staff member on Capitol Hill, especially if you were a woman, was could you type? So I took a typing test, and I passed the typing test, and I landed a job in a member of Congress's office. So there you have it, 20-something years old, and I can type, and I'm helping determine policy for the country. But I spent a number of years on Capitol Hill, all told about 8 years, 5 of which were with Congressman Andy Ireland. During that time, I did finish my undergraduate degree. When I left Congress, I went to law school for a few years, graduated from law school. Congressman Ireland had retired from Congress at that point, and he was off to go work for a company that then was called Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, but now is known as Feld Entertainment, and I think many of you know they've just relocated back to Manatee County. He was going there to help them create an in-house government affairs division. Their corporate footprint had grown to where they knew they needed somebody to help keep an eye on how laws and regulations were starting to impact their ability to do business. And Congressman Ireland can be very persuasive. I turned him down 3 times. He then called my husband and talked my husband into talking me into taking the job. So I was outnumbered at that point, and so I took the job. And that's sort of how my lobbying career began. Since that time, I have gone on to be an independent lobbyist for a while, and now I'm with a law firm in Washington, D.C. And I have a variety of clients, so my expertise is broad. A jack of all trades and a master of none in some regard. But my clients are diverse as Mote Marine Laboratory. I still do work for Feld Entertainment. I represent the dairy industry. Our firm represents a lot of trade clients. I do oil and gas. We do telecommunications. So it's an exciting career. It gives me a lot of diversity and keeps me very busy. So I think that kind of is how I ended up here.
And you can live in Longboat Key.
I can, the beauty of technology is that I can live on Longboat Key and I commute to Washington, D.C. every other week. So it lets me live in paradise and still do what I love to do.
I'm going to ask Sandy Stewart next. Sandy was the Assistant Secretary of Defense when I met her back in the 90s and under the Clinton administration. So you worked for a Republican politicians, and you worked for a Democrat. So Sandy, let me hear how you got started into lobbying.
This is just to show that bipartisanship still exists in this world. And we always laugh about being a lobbyist. We talk about the scarlet L that we have on our forehead. And so I too, like Joan, hope that we can put aside some of the misconceptions. Let me just start out by saying everyone has a lobbyist in Washington and probably in Tallahassee. If you're a nurse, if you're a doctor, if you're in a labor union, if you're a senior citizen, there are lobbies for just about everything. There are even associations for associations. So everyone has a lobbyist, and it's your voice to your elected representatives or to your government. And so it actually serves, we think, a very good and positive purpose. There certainly you hear about some of the horror stories, if you will, but for the most part, it's people doing their job and doing it well. I started out, my family had always been involved in Democratic politics. I'm from North Carolina, Winston-Salem, and so I think it was in my DNA to begin with. And then I ended up on Capitol Hill in a beginning position after law school, and then I rose up to become a chief of staff to a member from California. Louder? I'm sorry. My voice is a little soft. Speak softly and carry a big stick. I always go by that. Anyway, I just rose up through the ranks on Capitol Hill and became chief of staff to a member from California. And he got into the House leadership, so I thereby, as his top staffer, became part of the Democratic leadership staff. And at that time, the Democrats were in control of Congress and had been for 40, well, they lost it after 40 years, but had been for a long time. So I was involved in a lot of the decisions and so forth that the leadership makes, and that was a very interesting place to be. You're kind of in the heart of what goes on in D.C. And then I was selected to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs in the Clinton administration. I had to be confirmed by Congress. I traveled all over the world. I was fortunate enough to be able to travel on some trips to see our troops and to meet with a lot of the leaders of different countries, with Dan and his wife, Glenda. And we also had, Bosnia was going on at the time, so I say I fought wars, and was very involved in foreign policy matters in that job. And when I left there after 5 years, I went, as we say in Washington, downtown and became a lobbyist. And I joined a lobbying firm and became a senior partner there and represented a real cross-section of clients, from people in the movie industry, the music industry. I actually represented Microsoft when they were going through their big harangue with the government and when they actually started hiring lobbyists to help them. And I've represented pro bono clients, children's issues, and then I've represented foreign countries. I represented Greece. In fact, that's where I was on 9/11. Took a while to get back to the States. After about 13 years there, I decided that I really wanted to spend much more time in Sarasota. My husband and I had moved here, and so I left there, formed my own firm, and am affiliated with a large law firm in D.C., Arent Fox. And my major client is Google. And a friend of mine said, "Google, aren't you a little old to be representing Google?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'm part of their diversity program with getting the baby boomers. That's one of their requirements." But anyway, it's most interesting, and it keeps me very involved in a lot of the issues that the tech companies have to deal with. So it's been interesting to represent the content people, i.e. movies and music, and then represent the tech people that provide the vehicle to bring you your music and so forth. So that's kind of it as far as my career. And I'll turn it over to
And we'll have
Casey.
Casey Welch, who worked for Adam Putman, who is now our Agriculture Commissioner. You didn't work for him in Tallahassee, did you?
I worked with him in Tallahassee,
Okay.
but I'll go through that. Thank you,
Okay.
Congressman.
And,
thank you all
Casey.
very much for inviting me to be here, Congressman,
you.
and thank you. And Joan, my mentor down the end of the table, thanks for thanking me, inviting me to this as well. We've been very blessed in this area to be represented by wonderful, wonderful, outstanding individuals such as Dan Miller and his predecessor, Andy Ireland, going back to James Haley, and the members of Congress in this particular area, which is, I've been born and raised here, have been outstanding. So thank you for your service, sir. It was remarkable. I started, as I was just mentioning, I was born and raised here in Sarasota, and as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, well, a little bit bushier than I am now, went to D.C. for the first time in 1993, right after you were sworn in as a president of my 4-H club and also a Boys State member from the state of Florida. And you know, was awestruck by Capitol Hill and everything. And I said, boy, I could get used to this. I could really like this. And I came back and decided that that's what I wanted to do, be in politics. So I went off to college, studied political science. But instead of just staying on the college campus all day long, I went to school in Tallahassee. So I got a job full-time, well, full-time for a student, you know, working a little over 30 hours a week in the Capitol building. I worked for 3 sessions in the Florida legislature in the House of Representatives, and I worked for 1 year for Governor Jeb Bush, who was just elected in '98 at that time. So I learned right on the job. I'd go work all day in the Capitol building, and then I'd go to school, you know, afternoon classes and evening classes, and got a firsthand look at the inside of government, which was a great perspective to see how government worked on a daily basis and then learn how it was supposed to work in class every evening. So it was a great experience. Representative Putnam at that time was a 21-year-old member of the Florida House of Representatives, and he and I had been in 4-H together in the early 90s. So I had known him throughout that process, and then once he was an elected official, maintained that relationship, and he was elected to Congress to fill Charles Kennedy's who stepped down in 2000. So Representative Putnam was elected to the U.S. Congress at 26 to be the youngest member of Congress at that time, and I had an opportunity to, after graduating college, go to Washington, D.C. and become a member of his staff as a legislative assistant. So I worked with him for 3 terms and enjoyed my time in Washington, D.C., and was given an offer I couldn't refuse to move back to sunny, warm Florida as a lobbyist for the Florida Farm Bureau, and then eventually for the Florida citrus industry. So I did what Joan does now, which is I live down here, but I traveled and commuted back and forth to Washington, D.C. and work on agricultural issues up until a few years ago when the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee invited me to stay home and go back to Tallahassee and represent them up there, which I mainly do higher education issues at that time. So that's kind of a snapshot of how I got into the lobbying world. And I'll just say 2 quick little anecdotes to Sandy's point. When I first became a lobbyist, my granddad said to me, well, if they have a lobbyist, who's my lobbyist? And I said, well, Granddad, that's a good question. And as Sandy mentioned, you know, if you're a retired person, if you're, my granddad was an avid fisherman, there are many sportsmen's groups. If there isn't a lobbyist for it, I assure you someone is trying to figure out how to lobby for that group or person. And so if you feel like you are not represented, I assure you you are. You just may not know it. That's all I'd say.
Thank you, Casey. He worked for Adam Putman, and I don't know how many of y'all follow Adam. Adam was a guest in my class when he was actually in the House. I think Steve Bielak was at that class. It was when I was teaching a credit class at the university. But Adam is the Agriculture Commissioner now, but he had risen to a leadership rank in the House, which is, you know, a very small number of people. And you know, he's up for re-election this year, and there shouldn't be much doubt about it. But there's a good chance he's probably going to be running for governor in 4 years. He has a very bright future. He started as a member of the House of Representatives at age 26. He's articulate, likable, bright, and you know, wonderful future. So keep that here. Listen to that name, Adam Putman. He's in agriculture now, but he's got a much brighter future than just specializing in that. Let me note next we move to the question: have you described a specific projects you're working on now, just so we have an understanding of what you're really doing and how you're earning your money, sort of. So you want to start, Joan?
That's a great question. It's always important to explain to the client how you're earning the money. A lot of what we do can be a little bit hard to measure in terms of success. It's not always as simple as getting a bill passed or having a bill fail. There's a lot of nuance to it. But I have a couple of projects I'm working on right now, one of which is the Farm Bill. I do work on behalf of the Florida dairy industry. And the Farm Bill comes up every 4 years and determines farm policy and also certain programs like food stamps, also currently known as SNAP for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Washington loves acronyms. We're just crazy about them. Even FARM in the Farm Bill is an acronym. But having said that, I represent Florida Dairy. And what's interesting is that there's national groups that represent dairy industries. But Florida Dairy is very unique. We operate in a climate that is unlike what the rest of the country operates in terms of producing cows and milk. And so we have a very unique set of circumstances, and we have to make sure that the one-size-fits-all dairy policy that might be included in a Farm Bill takes into account some of the unique circumstances that we face down here in Florida. You probably wonder, well, why can't the Florida dairy folks just go to Washington and do that? Well, again, everybody has somebody representing them. Folks who are in dairy have a full-time job. So it's easier for them to come to somebody like me, educate me about their issues, and let me keep an eye on them in Washington. So the Farm Bill, as you may have been read, is about to hopefully pass the Congress. There's been a lot of haggling over some final issues, one of which is dairy, and one of which is the very issue that affects Florida dairy. So that's been something we've been working on a lot, spending a lot of time talking to our Florida delegation, educating them about dairy policy. When you get elected to Congress, I mean, Congressman Miller is a perfect example. Great small business background, knows his community, but did he go to Congress as an expert in dairy policy? I'm guessing not. So I have an entire Florida delegation that got elected with various levels of expertise, and their staff has various levels of expertise. But it's my job to make sure they understand the special circumstances and nuances affecting Florida dairy. So in that way, as a lobbyist, I'm really an educator. I'm going in, I'm educating, I'm advocating, I'm helping them understand a very complicated federal program and how it affects a very important Florida industry. A second program that I'm working on right now that's kind of near and dear and very close to home is there's a proposal from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service right now to list Siberian species of sturgeon on our U.S. Endangered Species Act. And you would wonder, well, why do we care? These species don't exist here in the U.S. They're outside this country. Listing them on the Endangered Species Act, that sounds like a nice thing because we know Siberian sturgeon in the wild is struggling to survive. Seems like an innocuous, harmless thing to do. Well, yes and no. Mote Marine Laboratory has a farm on the other side of I-75 where they've been investing in research and technology to grow Siberian sturgeon in captivity in an environmentally safe, sound way so that they can deliver sturgeon and caviar to the market and take the pressure off that wild stock that's being depleted outside of the U.S. So the risk here, of course, is the listing of these species under the Endangered Species Act would eliminate any commercial activity and trade involving those species and their products. So it's going to take basically years of research and hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment, wipe it off the face of the earth. There are other folks in Florida, in North Carolina, in California, who are also farming sturgeon. These are family-run businesses. These are livelihoods. These will be wiped off the face of the earth with the listing of these species under the Endangered Species Act. So what's our job here? Our job was to bring the sturgeon farmers together, to help them understand that they needed to have a unified voice, to take that voice to Washington, to help explain to the Fish and Wildlife Service what would happen if they did in fact list these species, and then to take that to Congress and say, Congress, you need to let Fish and Wildlife Service know that this action is going to hurt my constituents. It's going to hurt jobs. It's going to hurt our ability to do the research that is necessary to understand more about survival of sturgeon. So that's just a project we're working on now. We'll see how it turns out. We have a huge stake in this investment. But again, it's something that when you first hear about it, it sounds like a nice thing. But when you scratch beneath the surface, you see that there's unintended consequences from a government action, and it requires folks to step up and start educating people about what that means. So those are just kind of two things working on right now that local, touch everybody's lives in some way.
Great. I didn't remember the dairy. I had to learn dairy
Makes your
issues.
brain hurt.
There is a dairy I visited out east, and cows in Florida, because of the warm weather, don't produce as much milk as cows up in Wisconsin or Vermont. And so there's a lot of differences in the dairy needs around the country. By the way, we are going to have time for questions towards the end, so think of anything you want to ask, but we'll keep going through this discussion until we're ready for questions. Sandy.
Do you want me to talk about a particular issue?
Yeah, a particular issue that you're working on, so we just get a better understanding of what y'all
Okay.
do.
As I said, I represent Google. And one of the issues we've been lobbying on has to do with patents. As you can well imagine, in the tech industry, patents are the lifeblood of any technology company. And it's their intellectual property, and they own it, and they want to preserve it, and they want to be able, in Google's case, to be able to use it to create new and better products and services for the people that in the country and throughout the world. There's such a thing you may have heard of called patent trolls. And patent trolls, in a nutshell, are hedge funds or other entities that buy patents. Say someone owns a patent and they die, they'll go to the widow or widower and say, can we buy that patent, the right to that patent? And they acquire them through in different ways. And then they use those patents to come after people who are using a particular product. Let me give you an example. You open up a small business. You are going to scan someone's credit card to buy merchandise. When you scan that card, that's a patent. It can be multiple patents that allow you to do that on the card and in the machine. And if a patent troll or a company that owns the patent sees that, they come after you, and suddenly you get a letter and it says you have to cease and desist from using that scanning machine until you pay us for the right to use our patent. So this is the kind of thing that can affect small business. It's the kind of thing that can affect huge, large businesses. The banks had a tremendous problem. You know, when you scan a check or you process a check through a machine at the ATM, those sorts of things, those are all patented products. And when they passed the Frank Dodd bill about a year or so ago, dealing with the banks and the problems we had, they put provisions that help protect the banks from these patent trolls. So they turned from banking issues and financial services to other things like small business people, certainly to the tech companies because of all the patents. They even went to, we found that transit services, your local transit service, were being affected by the patent trolls. And if, for instance, if you're a small businessman and you get a letter saying we're going to sue you if you don't stop using this particular service or product, what do? It's a huge cost for you to be able to deal with that. So what we're doing is we're trying to educate members of Congress about what's really going on in the patent world. There are members, we call them members who are analog and members who are digital. And there's kind of a divide, as I think we all can understand. And so you really have to explain, and you have to help them understand what's happening. And if I talk about patents in overarching policy issues or about huge companies, it doesn't necessarily resonate. There's nothing more important than talking to a member about how his or her local constituents are being affected, what's happening in the district. So when I go in and I talk about cases where an individual in his or her district may have been affected or was affected by people that are suing them for the right to use processes that seem to be in the public domain. So that's one of the major issues that I've been lobbying on for Google. And then, of course, all the issues dealing with surveillance and the government getting data and this sort of thing. I won't go into all that, but those are some other issues that I've been working on. So,
Casey, you lobbied Tallahassee, which is obviously a little different, but a lot of similarities. So
Right.
give us some insight.
I was paroled like you, time served in D.C., so I'm back in Tallahassee. One of the issues that I've been working on since I've been working here at USF Sarasota Manatee that's important to every single person in this entire room is getting a traffic signal out front, which everyone probably who's tried to turn in and out of here thinks, why is there not a traffic signal here? Well, I have a whole 3-ring binder to tell you why, and it's the beauty of the cross-section of the federal government, the state government, and the local government meeting right out in front of this building. That's a U.S. highway, which is also a state highway. This is state property, but there's also county property, the Crosley Mansion that's behind us, and then across the street is the airport, which is a quasi-local governing board that has interest in this whole area. So it's a very, very interesting issue, and I've been working on that for almost 3 years going on now, and I'll be happy to answer questions about that. But what that means is there's federal laws and federal regulations that govern where traffic signals can be placed, their spacing, what the road speed limit has to be for a 6-lane highway versus a 4-lane highway, is where do you put medians, how does the median affect that, and then of course you layer that with the state laws and regulations on how far apart they can be, what are the speed regulations in and out. If we put the traffic signal at our main entrance, does that close the next entrance to the Crosley Mansion, which doesn't let you get into the subway and Captain Brian's next door, which affects the spacing, which the county line between Sarasota and Manatee County would be the next median cut. I can go ad nauseum. My wife has told me to stop talking to her about it, as you can imagine. But it is the perfect storm of government at every level prohibiting a traffic signal. This is the best part. That's already paid for from being installed here at this school. So that's something that I work on. That is a lobbying issue that's from the county commission to the halls of Congress and the Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C. It's an incredible issue, but that's just one kind of snapshot of something that I work on a daily basis that, you know, if you don't have somebody that's wading through all those issues and know the different interests, and they have thrown up their hands since this building was built in 2006. So
Universities have large lobbying organizations. And for the state of Florida, there's a state of Florida lobbying organization in in Washington and Tallahassee, that lobby all the different issues for the state. And then the university has their lobbying for all the universities in the state. And then each of the universities have a lobbyist. These are basically full-time lobbyists, I think. For like University of South Florida has their lobbyist, University of Florida lobbyists, FSU has a lobbyist. And then you have the same down in Tallahassee. It's a huge, the universities, all the big universities, I have 3 university degrees, so they all love to come see me, thinking that, I'm going to help them. But it was amazing, the number of lobbyists just working for the state of Florida and the university systems in the state of Florida. Let me move on, and we can open it up whatever order you want to respond. But one question I have is, what is the biggest misperception the public has about lobbyists? There's a lot of, lobbyists are held in a little higher esteem than members of Congress, but probably not much more. But what is the biggest misperception? Who would like to? Okay, Casey.
I'd like to go. I came to this very naive, being a lobbyist. I grew up on a farm. I'm from Florida. I worked with a member of Congress who was on the Agriculture Committee. It was, seemed kind of like, well, this was kind of a no-brainer. But 2 things I learned right away about lobbying, and I think, and I keep using them to this day, and feel free to use these, they're not mine, is first, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And that's a fact, whether it's in Washington or Tallahassee. So I learned right away it's better to be at the table than on the menu. And the second thing is a lobbying mentor of mine told me, lobbyists are the people you hire to protect you from the people you elect. And I think that's a true statement as well. And it's I don't want to say it's a battle or a game, but people talk about for every one member of Congress or every one member of the legislature, there's X number of lobbyists. But I think the next step is how many lobbyists there are or members of Congress versus bureaucrats within the entire system. If you start talking about those numbers, the people that, while there may be a 20-page, 50-page bill who write, 10 times that in regulations that affect everything we do. I mean, that's what I feel like we deal with on a daily basis is what's the spacing between, again, back to the traffic schedule, what's the spacing between on medians and those sorts of things? That wasn't written into law by a congressman or state. It's, we need to have safety standards, but they delegate that to the bureaucracy to implement and do all those things. And that's, as all things, the devil's in the details. So I think that's the biggest misconception about lobbying is, it's playing golf, it's going on junkets, it's, wine and dining and having great times. And, I will be the first to say I love eating and drinking and doing all that good stuff well, but at the end of the day, people hire you because you're producing a product or you're helping advise them on making business decisions on an everyday basis. And I think that's where the misconceptions lie in what we do.
What portion of your time is dealt with legislative versus the regulatory side? Each of y'all.
Just from my perspective, as you know, Congressman, the Florida legislature is a part-time legislature, so they meet for 60 days a year, and then they meet once a week, basically every month out of the year. So I would say a quarter of my time is with that, and then the other 3/4 of my time is with the regulatory agency which for the state university system is the Board of Governors and that agency. And then, of course, we have our own internal Board of Trustees with the university system. Each university has their Board of Trustees, which is appointed by the governor. So you add in those two layers as opposed to, getting down into the minutiae of university politics. It's mainly in that regulatory, internal realm as opposed to walking the halls in the Capitol.
I probably spend the bulk of my time with the Congress, but I do some regulatory work. But mine's primarily with the Congress. And in a lot of cases, it's also advising how to work with the bureaucracy or how to work the bureaucracy. But as far as sort of the day-to-day, most of it is with the Congress.
And I think back to the misconception. I think we've all made that point that somehow we're just here for the special interests. But I would make the argument that everybody in this room has their own special interest, and we all think of our interests as special. For my clients, it's mostly about either protecting their right to do business and their ability to keep a level playing field in the face of government regulations and laws that might tilt the field one way or the other. For a client like Mote Marine Laboratory and for Casey with the university, it's a constant search for funding to keep programs running and to keep research flowing and to keep education going. But I spend, I will say one thing, we lobbyists also spend a lot of time with each other. We are your eyes and ears in Washington for whomever we represent or in Tallahassee. And so intelligence gathering, finding out who's doing what, and trying to operate in an environment of no surprises, making sure that we know what's going to happen before it happens so that our clients are not caught off guard and we're well prepared to answer the questions and provide the information that we need to provide. So we do spend a lot of time with each other, especially now that there's gift bans and we can't take staff or members for a cup of coffee, so we sit around and have coffee with each other. But it is a large part of what we do is just gathering that information and knowing what's going on and trying to prepare for that.
Let me ask a question about the regulations that apply to lobbyists. I know there's a variety of regulations about, former members of Congress lobbying and former staffers lobbying and the regulations and what you can give and can't give. And so who wants to start with that one?
We are highly regulated and highly scrutinized. Every time somebody does something wrong and it gets on the front page of the paper, the next thing you know, there's another set of rules coming down. As lobbyists, we have to register. We have to describe our clients. We have to describe to some degree the amount of money that we are being paid to do our lobbying. We have to list the issues that we are working on, and we have to describe the agencies and branches of government that we are lobbying. So it's all public record. We do it 4 times a year. In addition, twice a year, we have to fully disclose any political campaign contribution we give. So we also have to do that twice a year. So it's pretty much an open book. We put it all out there, and it's public information for anybody to see.
That's pretty. And the other thing on, you're not allowed. There are rules where you're not allowed to basically take members of Congress or staff out for meals, or you're not allowed to give gifts, that sort of thing. That did go on a lot in the past, but does not go on today. There's a lot of fundraising that goes on, and in some ways that's kind of filled in for where there used to be more social interaction. Now it seems to be done more through fundraisers. But we are a highly regulated industry.
I'll just, I agree with everything they said. I'll talk about Tallahassee. It's similar in the sense that you have to file. I'm registered with the legislature. It's public record who I lobby for, and you can look up in 2 seconds on your phone or tablet or whatever device and pull that up and see who I lobby for and who is my principal and who other principals I represent. And I mean, it's very easy to do that. And as far as the financial disclosure, it's a little bit different than the federal system, which I previously did as well. But in Tallahassee, you provide ranges of your clientele. So you'll say, you know, I have 5 clients and they pay me between $50,000 and $75,000. So it's not as fine-tuned as the DC system, but there is talk in Tallahassee of going mainly to the DC system of just completely full disclosure. One other thing I'll mention about the disclosure, because of the changes since you've been in Congress, Congressman, and even since I left in the mid-2000s, and also in Tallahassee, even at an event like this, if Congressman Miller was a sitting representative in the Florida legislature and we are here on the USF campus, I would not be allowed by state law to give him a cup of coffee. I mean, it's very strict. Now, I'm not going to say that's good or bad, but it's a very strict, set of rules. My wife works for a congressman. I'm a lobbyist. We have friends that we worked on Capitol Hill with that are now lobbyists or work for a congressman. And even if we go on trips together and do that, there's, we, disclose that to people. And it's out in the open. It didn't used to be like that. I think the movie The Distinguished Gentleman probably put some light on some of that stuff. But I think we're very, very highly regulated, my personal opinion.
One of the misperceptions that we wander around with bags of money trying to buy everybody's votes and buy everybody's support. I think you could do an entire class based on whether the disclosure rules and the lobbying requirements have made it a better system, a worse system, or just a system with more rules. But nevertheless, we have the rules. We abide by them. We do what we do for a lot of different reasons. It is one of the major misconceptions, and shining a light on it is probably as good public policy as you can have.
Actually, I remember when Republicans first took control of the House in '95, and Newt Gingrich tightened up the regulations, and he said you couldn't get anything for more than a $5 gift. Well, you'd have the Boy Scouts come up and give you a Boy Scout cap or something, or a coffee mug. Well, you had to politely say, I can't take it. And so then they raised it to $25. But what is $25? And so it was a mess back then, and you just learn you just can't touch that and such. You mentioned the funding. Let's talk about the money issue and such, and fundraisers and what role that plays. These fundraisers are an opportunity to interact with members of Congress. You brought up the issue. I'm going to let you talk, Stan.
All right. I guess having been involved in this for almost 30 years, I've probably seen quite a few changes in that regard. There are limits to how much any individual or corporation or political action committee, a political action committee would be formed usually by a corporation, and their employees contribute money to it totally voluntarily. You're never required to do that, but you contribute money to it, and then they have this collective amount of money in a political action committee or a PAC, as we abbreviate. As Joan said, we like abbreviations in D.C. And they can use, the people in Washington that lobby for that particular company can use the funds to give to members of Congress or to the administration or to the president, depending. But what has happened is, while there are strict limits on the amount that I as an individual or any company can give to a member of Congress, there has been this new effort created where there are unlimited amounts of money available through these, I guess, special PACs. I'm not super PACs, pretty much, and where you don't necessarily have to disclose who the givers are, and that the people that run these super PACs can then use the money, not necessarily directly to the member of Congress, but they can use it to run ads or advocacy issues and so forth. So there's a lot of money in the system now that didn't exist to this degree before. And it has really changed the way that campaigns operate now, and the way that I think Washington functions, and probably the state as well. I don't know much about that area, but it's now, because you either meet with a member or their staff in their office, or you might go down to the Rayburn building, to the cafeteria there in D.C., and they'll buy their coffee and you buy your coffee, because you're not allowed to buy each other coffee. Or they can buy me coffee. They can buy us stuff. But you either interact that way. It used to be that you could go out for dinner or you could have lunch and you could discuss issues and so forth. But now, because of the gift bans that have been put into place, there's not that sort of interaction very much anymore. So where do you see people? You see them at fundraising events. So a lot of our time and effort seems to be spent in that regard, whether we're giving personal money, which over the years I've given a great deal, or whether it's the client that you're representing. So there's really been a big change, and members of Congress now spend a great deal of time trying to raise money, because campaigns have become just so expensive. And so to win re-election, they have to spend a great deal of their time on the telephone or at events or things of that sort. So money has, it's always been the mother's milk of politics, as an old Politico person from California used to say, Jess Unruh. But it has gotten to be just so much more pervasive, I think, in the system. It's not the only issue, but that's certainly one of them.
When I was first working on Capitol Hill, my boss, Andy Ireland, had one fundraiser a year. These folks these days can have several a week, where they're just constantly having to raise money. The cost of running an election has become so much greater with all the media markets that you buy into. And then you have these super PACs that Sandy mentioned, which aren't necessarily local, but they're raising millions of dollars, and they're coming into congressional districts to push an agenda that's a national agenda or very specific to this super PAC. So when you're sitting here during election, and I know in Florida as the battleground, we grow very weary of the number of political ads we see each election cycle. But it'd be interesting when you pay closer attention to notice how many of those ads are not being run by the actual member running for election. They're being paid for by an outside group, a national group, a super PAC that has raised money, that has a larger agenda than just local politics. And that has really changed the landscape of elections. It's changed the outcome of elections, and it's changed how the money's raised. And I would put out there as a topic for thought, you know, what do you think is a more corrupting influence? Me buying somebody a cup of coffee in the Rayburn cafeteria, or me showing up with a $50,000 check from a super PAC to attend a 3-day, traveling fundraiser? So, there's a lot of things that are going on that are changing the nature of how it goes on. A lot of disclosure goes on, and those are the checks and balances that happen. But it's a different animal than when you were doing it.
Yeah, money is different. I just got an email invited to an event, a fundraiser for John Boehner is going to be in town here in a few weeks, and I'm sure anybody wanted could go to it. You can get 4 people to join them for cocktails and dinner. I think it's $50,000 in Sarasota, so it's convenient. It's, but I mean, everybody does it. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, there was an article, raised $80-some million last year for congressional races. I mean, one reason she's popular with her base in the House is she's a great fundraiser. John Boehner has to spend a great deal of time and money traveling the country raising money for other House members, and that's part of their jobs. Let me ask one more question before we open it up about the partisanship in lobbying, and it's good because Joan, you worked for a Republican, you worked for a Democrat, Casey, you worked for. How partisan is it? In some cases, you know, Democrats have to lobby Democrats, and Republicans lobby Republicans. Who wants to start that one?
It's different for different lobbyists. So I would just say the answer is it depends. My history leading up to the job I do now was not necessarily grounded in politics. A lot of folks come into politics and into policy and into lobbying from a background possibly working on campaigns. That's a partisan activity. Mine was just really more serendipity in terms of how I ended up where I ended up. But my history is that I have worked for Republicans. Within my law firm, I am considered to be a Republican lobbyist. That being said, when it comes to my Florida clients, I'm going to work the entire Florida delegation, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or in between, because there I'm just representing the interests of a state-based activity that needs bipartisanship to move forward. So while just by natural affinity with the folks that I spend time with, I may spend more time with Republicans, it doesn't mean that I cannot go knock on the door of a Democrat, and in fact I do that on a regular basis, because that's what's in the best interests of my client. So there are lobbyists who stick very, very strictly to D or R, and then there's others who are more bipartisan because that's what the job requires. And again, it's kind of it's an evolution of where you came from and where you end up.
I completely agree with that. I came from a more political background. I was a very partisan Democrat. And when I was working on Capitol Hill in the leadership, I was a very partisan Democrat. And then I was appointed to a position in the administration over at Department of Defense. And my first 10 days on the job, I was having dinner and I was seated by a gentleman. He said, "How's it going?" And I said, "Well, I'm just having trouble dealing with, you know, the views of Republicans and so forth." And he said, "Let me tell you something, young lady." I was a young lady at the time. And he said, "If you want to do this job and you want to do it well, you better get over that." And that was probably the best advice I got. And suddenly I began to interact a lot more with the Republican members and Republican staff, grew to be very good friends with many of them, learned to work on their issues and to understand where they were coming from better. And so I became, as everyone knows that I'm a Democrat, but they also know that I can work both sides of the issue, or both parties on the issue, independents as well, the 4 of them that are in Congress. Yeah. And, but I think it's true. What has happened is it has become much more partisan, and people are more identified as being on one side or the other. But there's still many of us that can cross lines, and I think that's true with members of Congress. If I can just add one thing, I think there are a number of things that are keeping the Congress dysfunctional. And a number of things that have happened that have added to that, and why there's so much partisanship. Redistricting has a lot to do with it. When the state legislature draws the maps, it draws Democratic districts and Republican districts. So if you're a member from a Republican district, you're going to tend to vote in that way. If you're a member from a liberal Democratic district, you're going to vote that way. And you don't have much incentive to vote in a bipartisan way. Then you have the growth of the media, which is just, it used to be that the media was in the background in Washington. Today they're in the forefront, and our celebrity culture. So everything anyone does comes out in the media. And the more they can sensationalize an issue, the better it is. One example, Chris Christie and his problems up in New Jersey with the bridge. MSNBC has made that a major feature, just major. And they're getting more attention because they can scandalize it. Casey Anthony, the case of the young woman who allegedly murdered her child, that got sensationalized, and people were watching that. And so there's a lot of incentive to take any issue and blow it up and make it more scandalized. Then you have all the political consultants who are running campaigns, and they want to charge a lot of money for their ads and for their advice. And so, and then you have all the different special interest groups, and that can be anywhere from Goldman Sachs to the Right to Life groups. You have all of that going on. Members don't live in their districts anymore. I mean, excuse me, they live in their districts. They don't live in Washington. They don't interact with each other. They don't travel together a great deal. All those things, and then of course we talked about all the money in politics today. So all these things are keeping a fight going and perpetuating instead of bipartisanship and working together, they're perpetuating very serious partisanship. And that's why you don't have as many people crossing the aisles and being able to work together.
I think the Blue Dogs is a perfect example.
They are.
There was a group in Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives known as the Blue Dogs, very conservative Democrats. They have seen their numbers in the last 2 or 3 election cycles shrink from 80-something members down to, I think there's maybe 6 or 7 left that are running for re-election. Redistricting has basically bumped them off. They get primary opposition, or they just can't win the general election. So this moderate voice that used to be a very important part of Congress has been absolutely decimated, and that's mainly due to redistricting and the creation of a more partisan environment, which I also see more so at the staff level than I used to see. It used to be that the staff was much more collegial and worked with one another, and now staff has sort of become more partisan as well. But just to
I'll just touch on that just for a second, because I think that's a very good point. When I was a staff member in the Florida legislature, who at that time had just came under Republican power in 150 years since the Civil War, so it was a huge shift in Tallahassee. But they would argue, Republicans and Democrats would have very strong debates on the floor, and then literally walk 1 block from the Capitol and have beers afterwards, and everyone would sit there and have a nice time and enjoy it. And then I immediately went from that environment to Washington, D.C., and to what I called a bunker. Kind of everyone went to their bunker. There were Republican staff member bars and not, well, I mean, places that we went, and there was the Democrats, and well, we're going to go to Capitol this, and we're going to go to Hawk and Dove or whatever, and everyone just kind of, you played on your own softball team and kickball team, and everyone just divided. And it was such a stark contrast to getting on a plane in Tallahassee and landing in D.C. and saying, this is government. We're a bicameral legislature. Everyone works together. But it was a bunker mentality, and that was, like I said, 2000, and it just morphed and changed over time. And I think it's honestly a sad commentary on Washington, D.C. And I think that unfortunately is trickling down into the state legislatures now, because they're because of the money is trickling down, that attitude is trickling down, and that's. We don't have to get in there right now, but it's coming, unfortunately.
I have other questions, but I think now's the time to open it up. If you can, come to the microphone. If you can't, I'll repeat it.
First of all, I think this has been extremely interesting to me. I have a couple of questions. Do you also lobby the Senate, and do you handle those people differently than you do congressmen? That's one question. The other question is, I'm interested to know how the congressman reacts and gets information from the lobbyist. In other words, let's say on the dairy question, you're promoting one side of the story. Are there lobbyists that you ask for to come to you to give the other side, or you have to weigh which makes more sense to you? And regardless of what you say, what's the opinion of your constituents that's going to sway your vote, or the leadership that's going to sway your vote?
Great question. Complicated question. I'm going to let them answer first because I can have a chance next week to talk about that. So there's a lot of more complex parts to mine. But just briefly, for me, when I was in Congress, first of all, I had a kind of a rule in my office. I only met with lobbyists who had a local connection. So if someone was lobbying for Moat Marine, they could get into my office. Or if someone's, I remember a big issue that came before Congress was the credit unions. Well, if the credit unions wanted to meet with me, they had to bring local people with them from the credit union. And so you'd listen. Like dairy is not a big issue in Sarasota, Manatee counties. I know there's at least one dairy. I've been to it. And so you want to listen to that group too. So you listen. I used to do town hall meetings, and they were a great source of information. And some people persuaded me to change a vote at a town hall meeting after a while. And it was something, we have a lot of retired missionaries here in this area. And it was the treatment of some of the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, and the way the School of Americas that trained some of these evil dictators from the 1960s and 70s in Central America. And so they really hated that place. But they felt strong about it because they lived in these areas. So you listen, and town hall meetings was one big source, but someone locally always had access to me. It was harder to just get a lobby. And then you get lobbied mainly for the subcommittees you work with. I would not get too involved in a dairy issue because that gets resolved at a higher level than my area of interest was. I was into health issues you get into because I funded NIH areas, education areas, Commerce Department stuff, census. So I had people specialize up there. So, but we can talk about it more in class next week. But you want to handle some of this?
Sure. House versus Senate. A typical House staff is about 8 to 10 people. A typical Senate staff can be 40 people. So you do approach it the same way in terms of finding that staff person. A Senate staffer might have a higher level of sophistication or specialization on your issue than a House staffer that has to juggle more issues with less personnel. You probably have more opportunity to spend time with a member of the House than the Senate because, again, they tend to be a little bit more accessible. But at the end of the day, I would say it's fundamentally the same how you would approach it, House or Senate. To your question on if you're a member of Congress and you're trying to gather information on an issue, that's the job of your staff. And as former staff people, we can tell you that we spend a lot of time gathering and synthesizing that information. We will listen to the let's just use dairy as an example. We'll listen to the national dairy advocacy groups. There's going to be one that's going to be more about processed dairy products, cheese and yogurt. There's going to be one that's going to be more about fluid milk. Then you're going to drill down a little bit and find out what your local interests are. In my case, that would be Southeast Milk, which is the Florida cooperative. And then you're going to look sort of at what your leadership is doing, because again, there is a partisan element and there is a leadership issue. Back to dairy. John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, has taken a very strong stand against what he calls supply management, Soviet-style management of dairy. That's unusual for a Speaker of the House to come out this strongly, and it is a minority opinion in this Congress. It is also the position of my client, so we're hopeful. But that is definitely going to factor into how a member of Congress is going to vote, how his leadership wants him to vote. I will give an example recently of a member that I know who has asked his staff. He wants to see both the Republican and Democrat talking points on issues now because he's feeling that his party is giving him information that isn't necessarily the best place for him to be right now. So he's looking at both sides of that. So you put these into briefing papers and you give them to your boss, and then the local interests or even the national interests have access depending on that individual member's preference. I have had situations where a staff person has called and said, the congressman wants you to come in and brief him on this issue. He needs more level of detail than we're ready to provide him for. For a lobbyist, that's a gift, assuming it's a friendly audience and not a hostile audience. But there's all those different factors that come into play. And then to Congressman Miller's point, your committee assignment is going to dictate how deeply you delve into an issue or whether you treat it a little bit more superficially. So I hope that answers.
Let's go to some more questions, and I'm going to let you take the next set of questions. Yes, come in the back of the room. Come up the microphone if you would, please. Thank you.
Good morning, Fascinating discussion. Are there issues that you would morally, on moral grounds, not lobby for? And the reason why I asked that question is there was an article in the New York Times this Sunday about health care. And it talked about 750 lobbyists in Washington lobbying for people like dermatologists and oncologists, keeping their incomes high and making people, like every person in this room, paying more and more for cancer drugs. So I guess whether it's tobacco or other issues, maybe you don't get into it, but are there issues that on a moral ground you wouldn't choose to lobby for?
Absolutely. Tobacco would be one of them that I would not lobby for. I am. And Winston-Salem, home of Reynolds Tobacco. But I would not lobby on tobacco issues. So I think, and everyone probably has different. I wouldn't lobby for dictators. Let me tell you, the one thing, your reputation is basically all you have. And if you do anything to sully your reputation, if you lie or you represent people that you can't, with an honest face and an honest approach, represent the way they should be represented, you're gonna lose credibility. And once you've lost credibility in Washington, the game over. And so your word is your bond, and I think you have to. I feel very strongly about certain things, and I'll, act accordingly.
A couple more questions. Steve, you want to come over here?
For a company, say, like GE, how many lobbyists would GE be spending money on, and what would be their budget approximately a year for lobbying?
Gosh, well, GE has an in-house. They have an office in D.C., and they have in-house lobbyists. And I think that's probably about 8 to 10 people. Because GE is a big company. It has defense issues, it has electronic issues, it has trade issues, all sorts of things. Labor, absolutely. Yeah. And then they would hire outside lobbyists as well, individual lobbyists, to help them on certain issues. I don't know what GE's total lobbying budget is. It has to be, it's probably a couple million, I guess.
You can look it up.
Yeah, it's out there. It's in the public domain.
It's probably a couple million, and in addition to, they'll have folks that deal with Capitol Hill. They'll have folks that deal with certain regulatory agencies. So it can be a big team, plus they may hire specialized outside consultants like Sandy and I. Plus, they probably have a complete team of state lobbyists that would include folks like Casey. And then those state lobbyists would also, in turn, have consultants at the local level. So it can be fairly, but at the end of the day, it's protecting their ability to operate their business. It's an investment that, I have one client who said to me, you're a necessary evil on my budget. I mean, I need you to protect what I do, but I wish I didn't have to have you. But I think it is something that is an investment.
I was just going to add one thing, maybe just to clarify the difference between an in-house lobbyist and an outside lobbyist. We're talking, that's our kind of inside baseball terms. An in-house lobbyist is, for my example, I am an employee of the University of South Florida, so I am an in-house person. So General Electric has employees that are General Electric employees. They are paid by General Electric. Their business card says General Electric. Then there's outside consultants that, whatever their name of their firm is or their individual group, that's their business card. They represent that and multiple other clients. So GE's in-house people represent only GE. Outside people who have their own firms may represent just one client or 100 clients. So just to kind of give a little perspective of what the difference between those two terms.
Steve, welcome. I have a handout, so when you leave to pick this up. This was from The Hill yesterday, and it's Security Fears Stoke Tech Spending. And it talks about Microsoft spent $10.5 million last year on lobbying in 2013, and it spent $8.1 million in 2012. So this will give you some idea of what these type of corporations spend on what they define as lobbying, which has got to be a little grace. Yeah.
My question is for the gentleman on the panel. I've been an active member of the board of the Crosley Foundation since Manatee County bought it. And one of the first things on our agenda after we came back and forth a couple times was a light, a traffic light, either in front of Seagate Drive or the entrance to USF. My question to you is, that was 20 years now that we've been doing this. You see us getting a traffic light in the next 5 to 10 years or ever?
Well, for the record, I'm not here representing the University of South Florida, Sarasota Manatee. I've just been invited by the distinguished gentleman from Florida here as a former staffer and current lobbyist. But short answer is yes, if I have anything to say about it. It would have been here 2 years ago when I first got here and pulled in during this time of year when there's a whole slew of traffic coming south. But the long answer is I'll be happy to talk with you afterwards. The red tape that is involved it's the most mind-boggling issue I've ever been involved with, from the halls of Congress and traveling overseas and working to, county commission stuff. It is unbelievable, the red tape. So I'd be happy talking with you afterwards and go through all the answers.
Here's another question. Mm-hmm.
Are one of your clients or any of your clients, if you want to support a particular candidate, are you limited to how much funding you can give to their re-election campaign?
Yes. As a personal donor, there are limits. They're like 4,800. What is it now? Something like that. It changes. It sort of has a little bit of a cost of living increase. But yes, there's limits in how much I can give personally in a primary, in a general election.
Right. But how about your clients?
My clients, it depends on if they have a political action committee or if they're giving in their individual capacity. Again, there are limits. So yes, and it's fully disclosed.
We have time for one more?
Yes. Yes.
You're mentioning about the patent issues, about trying to do away with certain patents. I've been involved with that in the pharmaceutical industry, which has actually some very unusual patent rights, because you can extend a patent in the pharmaceutical industry for more than the 17 years. But what's the justification for doing away with a patent?
Oh, no, it's not doing away with the patents. I realized as I was talking, I probably wasn't making things terribly clear. What I'm talking about are those people that buy a patent just for the purpose of purchasing that patent and then going after people who are using the patent.
But that's the purpose of the patent laws, to protect individual inventions.
Right. These are third parties who are, and most of it's in the business patent area.
Right. They're called submarine patents, a lot of that.
Yeah, and, but it's not, what it is, it's not trying to prevent people from having their patent rights. It's trying to do something about the misuse of that patent right. And we're, and it's a pretty complex issue. It's being debated very heavily in Congress. The House just passed legislation that said basically if you are the owner of, and basically it affects not a legitimate owner but the patent trolls. If they go after a business and the business defends against itself, they would then have to bear the cost, the court costs and the lawyer costs and things like that. It's not doing away with patents. I'm sorry if I made that unclear. It's being able to regulate a little bit more about the use of the ability to use the patent process.
Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and conclude things. Let me thank our guest, Joan Galvin. Thank you for organizing this, Joan. And Sandy, it's nice seeing you again. And Casey, thank you very much. You just had to come upstairs or downstairs? Upstairs. So thank you all for, I think enlightening all of us. I found this interesting too, and I hope all of y'all enjoyed the past hour. So thank you all very much, and I'll see y'all next Thursday.